When you're watching a tournament in which Optic Gaming is playing, you never know, is Bot Alu going to turn up, the guy that everyone wanted cut from NIP and most recently was removed from FaZe? Or is God Alu going to turn up, the guy who hits all those clutch mid-range shots, who seems to have like icy cold killer instinct, who doesn't get phased, no pun intended obviously, by the big lights and just plays his game and probably overperforms at times? Well, if you know which Alu's going to turn up, I certainly wouldn't claim to, but it's exciting to find out. Then if you wanted to pick him for your fantasy team on esportspools, he's quite often actually a very reasonably rated player. He is someone who has these ups and downs, so he has tournaments that he does fantastically in. Someone to bear in mind, perhaps. Now, speaking of things that happen that are unexpected, unlikely, a classic complaint of mine in Counter-Strike is regarding best of one upsets. In general, I don't really like best of ones. I actually find they're the least interesting part of the tournament. They're certainly, in some senses, more exciting than series play, where it's more likely who will win and who will win the tournament. There's a reason why low-level teams or teams at the bottom of the top 10 very rarely ever win big tournaments that have a big field of top teams in them. And part of it is best of three, and part of it is having properly seeded brackets, etc. And the fact that you're very unlikely to get a super easy bracket draw where you face all the lower level teams like yourselves. But whenever people talk about upsets, a lot of people initially don't even isolate it to best of one. Like, I hear all the time when there are tournaments with big upsets like the major, I hear people say, oh, well, what happens is upsets happen more now because CSGO is just so competitive right now, which I could certainly see a case that at times during this year, I don't think right now, but at times during this year, such as the middle of the year, I think CSGO generally was more competitive than it has been, except certain periods in the past. I think like autumn of 2015 was very competitive and certainly can be up there with any other time period. But yes, it's not like some of the old days where the elite teams would pretty much never lose to the low-level teams, especially anyone outside of the top 10. Yes, there's a lot more parity now, but I don't think actually that these are the primary qualities making all these upsets happen. I think it is the best of one component that the majority of tournaments start with or have as part of their initial phase, whether that's some sort of a group phase, some sort of a Swiss system. So even best of one itself, I don't think it's been properly narrowed down why it causes so many upsets. Like, best of one's often been maligned for similar reasons as I've kind of outlined for its tendency to produce upsets. But why is that? Because, okay, let's go through some of the obvious ones, and perhaps not as obvious, but simpler to come up with and easier to identify. So sure, in a best of one, you're playing less maps than a best of three. You're playing at least, well, you can at least half as many, if not a third as many as a best of three. So you have less chance for the better team, the more highly seeded team, to recover from a bad start. There's less stamina and consistency required from the lower ranked team to actually win the game, because you don't have to win one map. There's less of an impact in a best of three on pistol round wins, because you can get a fluky couple of pistol rounds on one map, but if you have to play 4 or 6 pistol rounds, you know, you're going to regress to the mean. The better team on pistol rounds is probably going to win more of them, and even if you win the first 2, perhaps they win the next 4, and so actually overall your impact of winning a couple of fluky pistol rounds becomes less significant. But I think there are some more reasons, and some reasons that actually I think show the flaws of how we currently employ best of one, and might actually make people think again about some of those upsets, and it's not just that these underdog teams are better somehow. So first of all, you've got to start when you're on best of one with the veto system, because we have a veto system that is very different from best of threes, because in the current veto system we use for all tournaments that are best of one, typically in the top level of Counter-Strike, you ban out 6 of the maps, and the last map that is remaining is played. So we take turns alternating for Team A and Team B to ban out 3 maps each, which leaves 1 map, and we play that map. That means that when you think of it from the perspective of the lesser team, so we'll do that initially, the lower ranked team can remove either the 3 strongest map of the opponent, therefore making it less likely the opponent is incredibly dominant and strong, or they could remove their own 3 weakest maps, therefore meaning that the opponent can't play them on almost half the map pool that this lesser ranked team might be weak on. Now, obviously, those are extreme examples. Most teams are generally going to do a bit of both and ban out strong map by the opponent, ban out their own weakest maps, try and get it to one that they think makes a lot of sense. But the point is, we're tending to end up on maps that, if the lower level team wants to, are at the minimum in the middle of the pool. Sometimes we get a strong map for the higher ranked team because the lesser ranked team also wants to play it. Okay, sure, which also, by the way, in itself gives the lesser ranked team a chance to win because they're playing a strong map for the opponent, but they're making sure it's the one that they can play and that they have a good chance on. As, by the way, you saw most famously, I think, at IEM Katowice this year, where Heroic did a fantastic job of doing exactly that and making their higher ranked team think that they'd gotten the good map when actually it was playing into Heroic's wheelhouse, and they had the strong map for the opponent, but the map that Heroic wanted to play in each instance, and therefore they managed to win 3 of them and get out of that group stage and end up finishing top 4 thanks to skipping to the semi-finals. Now, beyond that, there's also the fact that, or rather, think of that context and now look at how it works in a best of 3. So in the best of 1s currently, you can ban out 3 strongest maps of your opponent, or you can ban out your own weakest 3 maps. If you play in a best of 3, well, first of all, you can only ban 1 map, then your opponent gets to pick. So let's say you're the lower ranked team and you ban out your absolute worst map. Now the opponent can pick your second worst map as his map pick. You've got a very good chance of losing his map pick as a result. Likewise, in this scenario, you might ban their strongest map, but they can pick their second strongest map. So again, they can still get this a very strong map for their pick. Now you go, after the first couple of picks, you go to the second rotation bans, right? So you get to ban a second time. That means when you get to the decider, you have still only banned 2 maps. The decider could end up being your 3rd weakest map, or the decider could end up being their 3rd strongest map. We're talking, again, in extremes and in an abstract sense, because we're not going to isolate specific teams. We're talking about generally how the format works. These factors are all going to make it more likely in a best of 3 that the higher ranked team wins and that the lower level team, especially if they have a shallow map pool, isn't going to win. A narrow map pool isn't going to win. Whereas in best of 1s, this is less of an issue thanks to the veto system we use, and it gives a better chance for the lower ranked team to win. Then you've got to add in from the favourites end of the equation. I don't blame the format for this, but just psychologically, I notice a lot of favourites actually try to go with safer picks in the veto system for best of 1s, as in they don't just ban out the 3 weakest maps of the opponent. They don't just make sure that as many of their strong maps are in. Oftentimes, they're willing to say, even though this is a weak map for the opponent, I'll ban it as well, because I actually don't want to play it myself. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I'd rather play so that we're both on a map that we like and it's a strong map. Famously, North do this a lot. I think G2 does it a lot as well, quite frankly. SK even can be guilty of this, which is why they tend to score and get an upset scored against them in a lot of tournaments. Whereas, oftentimes, these teams have a map like Nuke or Cash, which they don't have to waste a ban on because they can play and be very good on, but they don't want to play them because at the moment, not many teams like those maps. And so they think, I'd rather just play like a Cobble or an Overpass that I'm actually very good on and I think they're decent on or good on. So I'd rather just play Comfort. And therefore, I actually think top level teams often don't utilize this veto system to their advantage. So you can't blame the format for that. That's the fault of the pro players. But this is another factor, I think, as to why you have more upsets in best of 1s. Because I think when you take out some of those maps that you should have probably pushed them to for your comfort, you're going to therefore essentially gift the lesser team a better chance on the map that they end up playing. Finally, this is a secondary point because it's not going to exist all the time when we have this format, but just the map Nuke existing, I think, causes a problem because a lot of teams don't want to play it, even if they're very good on it. Therefore, you essentially end up with a 6-map pool because one of the 2 teams almost certainly is going to ban Nuke, even if it's a weak map for the opponent and a strong map for the team who could have kept it in there. So I think that also is skewing map pools in 2017 a lot more than it was in past years. Now, in terms of fixing this veto, it's kind of tough, right? Because it is, in terms of initial thoughts and vetoes that have been used, the veto systems used in the past, at the moment, it is one of the most fair. It's not like when we had a randomizer, because a randomizer would get rid of this. The problem is, randomizer also introduces an element, I think, of unfair play, where you end up with a scenario where there's 3 maps left, this lower level team absolutely can't play one of them, can play the other 2 to a decent level, randomizer picks one of the 2 that they can play to a decent level. I don't think that's particularly fair. And we've seen lots of instances of this happening, like Team Liquid at some of the majors in the past, where you can go and watch my reflections with Hiko, and he'll even just say, actually, yeah, we got lucky in a lot of those randomizer picks. Then you've got to consider, though, is there actually an alternative? Now, interesting enough, I saw an alternative. There's been alternatives in the past, like E-League has done different ones where, like, depending on whether you were Team A or Team B, and one of you got 3 bans and the other one got 2 bans, and then it randomized the last map. I actually thought a very good alternative was suggested to me by, I think it was on Twitter, a guy called David Coulter, and he said what he thinks they should do is the higher seeded team at the outset should pick to be Team A or Team B. And then what you do is Team B bans 2 of the 7 maps. So we've got 5 maps left after Team B bans. So the higher seed team can either pick to be the team who bans the maps, or they can let the other team ban the maps. Then Team A picks the map, so they pick one of the 5 maps remaining, but Team B picks the side. So the team that bans the maps don't get to choose the map, but they get to at least pick the side. So if, for example, we ban out 2 maps and then the opponent picks Nuke, cool, at least we can pick CT side. So I think there would actually be a lot of strategy involved in this. I think the fact that the higher seed team gets to pick which they want to be, A or B, also provides an interesting component, because depending psychologically how teams like to play out this scenario, I think some of them would end up in a weaker scenario, but through their own choice. I think also it would generally favor the better team, but in a sense where you still get a lot of wiggle room and a lot of play yourself. If you're the lower level team and you get put in the bad spot, whichever that might be for you in this scenario, I think you at least have some power over what happens. And therefore, I actually kind of like that. With that said, much as with all formats, I'd have to see it run. I'd have to see it actually play out over a few tournaments so that when there was weird upsets, I could isolate, was that because of the format? Is it because of just the play? And we could start to see, much as with Swiss System, where at first we just saw all the positives and how it was different and in some senses better than GSL. But as we saw it play out and a lot of the issues, such as the reseeding aspect, the fact that you don't use proper seeding initially, I think we eventually did see, actually, I think some of us prefer GSL system here, and let's just go with best of 3s, because the best of 1 aspect of Swiss System is still fucking us. So I'd have to see it play out, but I think it's worth a shot. I'd like to see a tournament try running that, some brave tournament organizer, because I think it could be really cool, especially once teams really get down to understanding how that format works, and you let people like Carrigan, like Glaive, like Fallen mess around with that system and see what little edges they can get and what approaches that they decide to take overall, or whether they change it up depending on the opponent. Because remember, you get to pick to be Team A or Team B. Now, I also think tournament format beyond best of 1s affects it, because you can have best of 1 but in different formats. Now, in GSL style system, you play 1 game a day, 1 best of 1 a day, but you know your opponents ahead of time. Like, you know already the 3 teams in your group, you know who you're going to play in your first match, and you can potentially guess who you're going to play in your second match. You've only got 2 opponents to have to prepare for after the first one. So actually, I think that provides, it makes it less likely there are best of 1 upsets in GSL than in some of the other formats. In the Swiss system, again, you play 1 game a day, but you only know your opponent at the end of the day. You can't prepare until all the games are finished, and then you find out who your opponent is. So you have less time to practice. So I think actually best of 1 upsets are more likely in Swiss system than GSL as a result, because less time to scout, less ability to look what the other opponent's doing. I actually think the format that produces the most upsets in best of 1, and I think this is borne out if you go and look at the playoffs for EPL, Season 6, you go and look at the playoffs for IEM Oakland, you'll see tons of surprise teams in the playoffs and tons of elite teams or top 5, top 6 teams who don't make the playoffs. And I think that the IEM/ESL Pro League season format, Season 6 format of a round robin of 6 teams where you play best of 1 is the format that produces the most best of 1 upsets. That's because it takes into account everything I just said about best of 1s and the veto system and team's psychological approach. And then you add in, you play a bunch of games in a row. Now, when it first started, you used to play all your games in a row because each group would be played in a day. So you could play 5 games in a row. Now we tend to play, some teams play 3 games, some teams play 2 games in the first series, in the first set rather, of day 1. And then on day 2, the remaining teams play either 3 or 2, and you end up playing your 5 maps over 2 days. But you're still playing more than 1 map a day. So that has its positives. You can get warmed up. You really get in a roll. Opponents can't necessarily adapt to what you're doing. But it has downsides as well, in contrast to the other formats, if you want to avoid upsets, which is there is less time to adapt and to fix your problems. So if you're having a bad first game, that can snowball into suddenly you're down 1-2 after the first 3, and you're in a tough spot to get out of the tournament. Then there's the fact that there is less time to scout opponents. So especially if their game's just been played after yours or just before yours. You can't really be watching their games and scouting them directly. And because you can't scout as much and you can't adapt as much, you're going to spend less time focusing on the underdogs and hope you can just win against them playing with skill. I mean, funnily enough, Lopez made an interesting abstract point about this during the last Snipe Live we did for IM Oakland, that when he would play in group stages, he purposely wouldn't use all of his tactics. Actually, he would just pog, and he would have his team play individually but together and just try and abuse pog style strats so that the opponent can't anti-strat you, so they can't get a little edge when you don't know them, and you just beat them with your superior skill. Whereas obviously if you play proper tactics, they can watch your demo. You're not going to watch them as much. If you're in a group with FaZe and SK, you're not going to spend your time watching Hellraisers because it wouldn't be a good allocation of your time. So it gives Hellraisers a better chance, especially if they prepared for you because you're the third best or second best team in the group. I also think that part of the reason why it's better to fix some of the best of one issues or make best of ones less impactful on the tournament is because most tournaments start with best of one, and therefore best of one results mess up or spoil the way a bracket will be played. Now, I made this point about this in my video about how upsets actually have a downside of spoiling the rest of the tournament, because you eliminate teams in the group stage that are actually much better and elite level teams in best of threes and playoff scenarios because they're not as good in best of one, and all these factors make it less likely that they win. That then makes the rest of the tournament less interesting as far as I'm concerned. I mean, a perfect example to me would be just go and look at the semi-finals of EPL Season 6 very recently. It featured two teams who were never going to win these best-of-3 series, who absolutely got rocked in these matches. Yet these are teams that in the group stage were scoring big wins upon teams of that level and actually eliminating teams that are much better than them overall. So personally, I want more best of threes to balance out and temper this erratic, yes at times exciting, but less predictable component of best of one. And that is that I would like more best of threes and best of threes to be more impactful on the route you have through the tournament. So I actually think no matter what system we use, you should always, in my opinion, have to win at least one best of three to get out of a group stage or initial phase. Because that way, if teams do the upsets in the best of one, they get to that big final match for a best of three. If they can then win a best of three, I just tip my hat. I don't ever get mad at the format and say, hey, you win it. If Envious, Hellraisers, Optic, Fnatic can win a best of three against an Astralis, North, G2, then fuck it. Hey, that's fine by me that they go to the playoffs. Not as cool if they just win a best of one and we have these weird streaks of matches where no one's getting time to adapt or to fix anything or to prepare for opponents properly. I also think, yeah, you can use wacky tournaments. I said this in the past about tournaments like IM. Yeah, I don't mind it being in the calendar. I think it's the weakest format, quite frankly. And I do think that it makes the results less impactful. Like, for example, I think Cloud9 finishing top 4 at ECS Season 3 didn't mean as much because they won 2 best of ones to get there. I think Big making it to top 8 of the major, getting a legend spot, didn't mean as much because they just won 3 best of ones in Swiss system, not reseeded to get there. I think you look at a tournament like DreamHack Malmo, which had a fantastic tournament format, which, by the way, in line with this, you had to win a best of 3 to get out the group stage. I think the results were a lot more legit, and I feel like those results meant a lot more. Hence why, when a team like North beat SK Gaming to get out in a best of 3, I thought, fucking hell, this is really legit. And when North went to the final, it made their overall result more legitimate, I think, and more impactful. So it's not just that best of ones cause upsets. It's not just that the game's so competitive now and that the teams are all so good that anyone can beat anyone on their day. I think there's some other factors and some nuanced factors that are playing into this that people perhaps haven't considered.
Yo, this is Alu. You got pretty big balls to watch Thorin's YouTube videos.